Welcome everyone to the 8th event in our series, Diverse Cities, and the 4th and final conversation exploring the language of change. Diversities is a collaboration between Shared Studios and Planet Word. And as a part of today's Diversities event, I am super excited to bring you 3 futures thinkers who are leveraging language and speculative practice to ask questions that might help us innovate and reimagine our futures. I'm Brandon Furter. I'm the Director of Global Community for Shared Studios, and I'll be moderating today's event. Today, we're going to have a really interactive conversation, and so we encourage you to use both the chat and we'll be engaging the polling function later in the conversation as well. I'd like everyone to begin as you arrive to please let us know where you are calling in from. And if you could include one word that would describe a future that you hope to exist, please include that word as well. I am also joined by Rebecca Roberts, the curator of programming for Planet Word. And Rebecca is going to share just a little bit more about Planet Word, the Planet Word portal, and all the great stuff they have going on over there. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thanks, Brendan. So Planet Word is a brand new museum of words and language. We're in downtown DC at 13th and K Northwest in a historic DC schoolhouse. That's it in my Zoom background. And we explore all the joy and wonder and inspiration of words and language in the museum. Unfortunately, we're not able to be open to the public right now because of COVID. We look forward to reopening as soon as we can. But in the meantime, we've had this wonderful excuse to explore all these virtual programs with partners all over the world. And Shared Studios has been our programming partner for a physical portal in the museum. But while we are unable to activate that, we've been having this diversity series, and I keep being surprised at how many we've done. This is the 8th one, and each exploring some aspect of words and language around the globe. And it's been great fun, and look for more as we continue to explore all the different ways that words and language intersect with activism and social justice and music and creativity around the world. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to welcoming you to Planet Word in person as soon as we can.
Awesome, looking forward to it. Thank you, Rebecca. And now let's meet our guests. We begin in beautiful Brooklyn, New York, where it was warm and now it's cold again. We have Doc Martens, a designer, creative technologist, maker, teacher, lifelong student, and self-professed geek, working to educate and empower communities to embrace the potential of speculative practice and understand how emerging technologies might be leveraged for social impact. Welcome, Doc.
Welcome. Hi. Sorry, this is me unmuting. Hi, everyone.
Next in Ottawa, we have Louisa G, a designer and creative strategist who catalyzes change by collaborating with artists, futurists, technologists, and social impact organizations to prototype meaningful digital and in real life interactions. Welcome. As I said, it was cold in Brooklyn. I'm wondering if it might be a bit colder in Ottawa. So welcome, Louisa.
Nice to meet you all. It is cold.
And finally, to someplace that may be a bit warmer, Guadalajara, Mexico, we have Andres Valencia, a strategic innovation consultant from Mexico, team principal at Change Consulting and Future Explorations firm, board advisor for the Latin American regional director of the Design Futures Initiative. Welcome, Andres. Maybe I shouldn't be jealous of the weather. Is it warmer there?
Super warm right now, starting the spring, so yes. Hola, Brandon. Hola todos.
That's what I thought. Well, thank you all for joining us. Like I said, I'm hoping to make this a really interactive session, and we'll be engaging the chat throughout. We will have a question and answer session. And so I encourage attendees, please feel free to put questions into the chat throughout the conversation. I'll do my best to get to those questions when we get to that portion of the conversation. And then again, prepare to use the polling function. We'll be doing a fun activity called Futures Flip that I'm looking forward to seeing what we can generate together as a group today. But I want to begin, I know for a number of us joining the conversation today, I've already started throwing around some terms like speculative practice and design futures and design thinking. I'm wondering, Doc, if you could, we'll put up a definition that is adapted from some of the work that you've shared in other platforms, but I'm wondering if you could first kind of talk to us a bit about what is speculative design.
Sure, but I just want to caveat this with, you're probably going to see And this is called a lot of different things. It's like our own sort of community of practice can't, come up with this one, but that's because there's so much diversity within it. And so I'll talk about what, speculative and design is, but more broadly, I would say that speculative is sort of a term that you would include before a practice sort of field to denote why you're doing it, right? And this is very famously comes out of a piece by Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby in their book, Speculative Everything, where they're saying there's two types of work we can do, especially in design. There's A, commercial profit seeking, and there's B, which is more speculative, right? We ask questions, we're not doing in that service. And so I would say that any practice can be speculative if you're doing it to explore the future and to open up ideas, to think about them, versus maybe to solve a problem or to sell a product. But specifically, design is really important because design actually makes the futures we inhabit. A lot of our lives around us are designed, mediated by technology. I'd say probably now more than in history. We interact with things that were designed for us every day. And so it's really important to take the speculative and the design and put them together, because in making things and designing them, we really have to think about the futures people will inhabit as their reality, because we're designing for people and for the future. And so I would say that, at the end of the day, this definition here, work that's using design to address the challenges and opportunities of the future, to explore those possibilities, right? And to speculate on how these different things could be, instead of trying to solve a problem today for the future necessarily. And that was my attempt, but there's a lot in there.
Yeah, and I think what's particularly interesting about this sort of practice is that there is kind of a bit of everything in there, and it opens up possibilities for us to understand the future in much different ways. And a lot of that has to do with the language that we use to engage this sort of practice. And so I want to open it up to everybody. Language and how we use it is a central component to both design and speculative thinking. And there are lots of different ways that we might explore this, from word tracing to linguistic differences and in various cultures. But I want to kind of ground our discussion today in practical tools that our audience might be able to use to innovate in their own lives. And I know that one way of doing that is simply by asking certain types of questions. And so I'm wondering if you all could talk to us a little bit about the practice of asking questions, and maybe even the difference between kind of a design question and a speculative question. I'll go ahead and turn it to you, Andres.
Yes, thank you, Brandon. So I will say that one of the abilities that we must have, to drive processes like innovation, especially for futures thinking, is questions. I once worked with this consultant in Chicago it was chief question officer, and his work was to make the right questions. So he usually used to be with clients before the work and the process and workshops and facilitation, just to understand like the places where the client needs were. So I think that's key, the questions. And secondly, turning this between innovation and futures, it's key because I believe that questions drive to knowledge. So we want to learn, we want to understand. That's why we have like key questions like the why not, like what if not, what else? And I don't want to talk too much with the first question, but I mean with the first answer, but I think that the first and most important thing is to understand that the way and the perspective and the focus of the first questions may or may not influence a better result for the process.
And building off of that idea that it may or may not create a better result as a result of that process. Luisa, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, Andres already kind of outlined some why, some what ifs. Are there particular types of questions that are better for engaging that process? Is there something that we might consider to be the best way to frame a question in order for us to get at more imaginative and innovative answers?
Yeah, I think there are some things that work particularly well, especially, you know, in a design and speculative process. And in my work, particularly engaging with the general public who might not have the academic words, you know, that are huge. So sometimes people arrive with their answers already, and it's very
Yes.
common that
Yes.
people, you know, everyone is primed for certainty, right? Like everything that we do, from, you know, if you go to university, you will get a job, right? That action that you take going to university leads to getting a job. That's being primed as a certainty. So a lot of people have these baggages when they arrive. And as a designer, for me, like I like to, you know, ask myself, like, what will my answers be? And I turn those into questions. And that way I open up the doors to people who, oh, like, I've never been asked these questions before. You know, your answers is different than mine. And then that starts a conversation. And I think that's probably the most important thing about asking questions is, you know, as a designer, you need to be genuinely curious about what other people's answers are.
That's awesome, Lisa. I just want to build up a little bit from there, because I once read that we don't ask questions because we already think we know the answer. So that's one of the limitations. So awesome, Lisa. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you, Andres, because I think there are a couple of really important points there. One, that we often arrive to a situation with the answer already, even when we think we're arriving by asking questions, particularly about solving complex problems. We often arrive with the answer already. And so I'm wondering, Doc, are there particular processes for engaging in question asking that help break us out of that tendency that Louisa talked about, our tendency towards certainty?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's specific things you can do, but you know, I've been struggling with this a little bit. So I'm like a very naturally, let's say, curious person, you know, and so coming into speculative, you know, learning about speculative design, speculation, you know, a lot of these things that we started to do, I felt was just like formalizing things that I was sort of doing naturally, but not thinking about. So reading a lot of science fiction. I don't know why, but specifically like while walking and in grad school, like thinking and then like shouting into Evernote in my phone. And like, you know, I've gone through and listened to some of my transcripts and I'm like, oh my God, like what was wrong with me that night? Like just being like decentralization, the internet, blockchain, like what's happening? Like what will happen? But I think it's really, I think the most important thing is like having this speculative mindset. And I just want to talk about things like every person can do. And I've often like have this thing I've sort of like come up with where it's like, in order to be successful, like really in life, but specifically in order to be a more flexible, speculative, resilient person, you need to do three things. You need to pay attention. You need to have the framework to understand what it is you're paying attention to, and you need to share it with other people and then go back to the beginning, right? And so if you think about all of the tools really we work with in speculative design, you know, from taking something today and putting it into the future, right? Extrapolating or speculating, to world building is going to be a big part of it, right? Whether that might be through writing or collaboratively, but actually, you know, taking the threads from today and building a narrative around it. Humans are narrative animals, right? So when we need to talk about these futures, we need to build narratives, build stories, build futures. We're going to have something around experiential, like the whole point of speculative design is design for critique, design for debate, design for discussion, design to change minds, right? As we said, it's not to make money or to sell a product, it's to open up conversation, to make somebody go, huh, you know, and almost like when when you're in a museum and you really see something that strikes you to your heart and you can't stop thinking about it the next day. And this actually happened to me, speaking of language, the other night, where I was having a discussion with some friends and I said, you know, I'd like to edit the master doc. And they said, you know, we are actually decolonizing our language and now we're using the word base template. And it was such a simple little thing that just like I had never thought of, that my mind just went boom. And I went down like all of these steps of thinking about language and how it's shaping my reality and design, right? So just these little moments of curiosity. And then finally to having people experience those, to get feedback from them, and finally to strategize, right? So now that we've made this artifact, we've made this story, you've read it, you've experienced it, how can we learn from you, or how can we work together with you to say, is that a future we want? Maybe not. Like, okay, so like, how do we steer away from that? Or like, that's something we like, how can we do more of that? And I'll just sort of finish with this interesting sort of play, since we're talking about language, is that question, right? The root word question, which is actually the same root word as to quest, which I've always really thought was pretty cool. If you think about every question as sort of going on this journey, is actually derived from Latin to mean to ask or to search for. Whereas speculate is actually comes from this idea of a watchtower, or to observe from a vantage point. And so I think it's kind of interesting as we think about, you know, the breakdowns of what it is we're doing here. You know, when we ask questions, we're going on a quest. And when we speculate, we're positioning ourselves at a unique vantage point in order to sort of understand things in a new way. So maybe we can do it. So it's really interesting. They both are doing sort of different things in a different way.
That's really, I love the idea of returning to the root of that word and thinking about questioning as a quest. And I also think a lot of what you're getting at here is, in the idea of to speculate, to be at a different vantage point, is when we're asking questions, really taking the time to consider things from a different vantage point. And a couple of things you touched on that I'm interested in hearing, Luisa and Andres, your take on this, as well as we consider language and humans as storytelling animals. And Doc, I know central to a lot of your work is looking at science fiction and how that creates new worlds for us to examine outside of kind of the current status quo. I'm wondering, what is the role of storytelling in shaping new futures? And are there certain storytelling practices that, since we're already, you know, naturally storytellers already, are there certain storytelling practices that we can engage that help us to imagine new worlds and break free of that, the kind of chains of the status quo?
Yes, definitely. I think that in two ways. The first one, we may use storytelling, you know, from the anthropologic or more ethnographic perspective. So we can use storytelling to understand, you know, like cultures, values, what's important for people, because we are used to, you know, with more market research mindset, you may understand like hard data, but through stories, you may understand what is important for people. So that's the way, for example, in design thinking and innovation, like a more strategic approach to just learn and leverage from that. So I think that's one perspective. And the second one, if we understand that this is speculative, like practice is like a framework, like Doc said, I think that we can use storytelling to build and to try to identify the new capabilities, like how we, you know, like how might we like deal with uncertainty of what's coming. So through stories, we may build possibilities. So through stories, we may feel like connected and identified. So just like a quick thought, as we go to the museum and we see and we understand what happened, you know, like a hindsight process, we can also, through stories and visualizations and storytelling, understand and perceive and connect with possibilities of what might happen. So I think that's two ways of how storytelling can relate to the practice.
Luisa, is there any? Oh, go ahead. Yes, please.
And I think just like another way of storytelling, I think, is sort of switching the perspective, right? Like, whose story is it? And the work that I have on coming up at the museum in Kitchener, we have done some conversions from the physical exhibition to like moving it to virtual and creating some workshops where a lot of we had 12 elderly joining us for the workshop, and then they like and the whole process was taking them through their memories and sort of this pretend future and interrogating two words. One is noise, the other one is quietness. And it was amazing. I didn't know what to expect, but it was amazing when people start sharing their own stories, and someone, one of the ladies were, I don't know I can't think about the future right now because my entire life is filled with noise because I moved in with my kids and grandkids, and they just makes a lot of noise, and I can't imagine the future right now. And people were encouraging her to tell, what is the now looking like for you? And it was just like the moment of coming together and everyone inhabiting each other's world. And it was so sweet. And people started changing their perspectives around loneliness and this pandemic, what has impacted their own lives. And I think just in real life that kind of unfolds in real time. People's minds started changing, and then people's kind of perspectives around their own struggles, like loneliness and dealing with noise, moving in with their kids and grandkids and all that, started to they start to solution like right on the point during that call. So I think that was just at the very least, if design can do something so small for people, sharing of stories and encouraging each other to kind of be inhabiting other people's stories is quite important.
Yeah, building off of what you said here, thinking about like whose story is it, and the ability to inhabit somebody else's story. I know that part of what we are, or what you all are, I won't put myself in the you all are experts, I'm not, but thinking about when we're imagining new futures, this breaking of the status quo, this sort of futures thinking is often really beneficial for, I guess what I'm thinking of is I can understand that being able to inhabit, I think lots of those folks, including myself, who might be on the margins of society, can see a different future because they are able to see the flaws of the status quo. But I'm wondering, how does this sort of question asking help those who are entrenched in a particular story start to envision something that looks quite different? Is that, am I too nebulous here, or the doctor, you see where I'm going? Or
I can try for this one. So one term I think is really interesting. So a lot of this idea of speculative design, right, is coming out of speculative fiction, which is really coming out of, as we said before, storytelling, right? We have been telling stories for thousands of years about things that we don't quite understand, or that we need to put into context, or that we need to sort of explain. And right now science is sort of our basis for looking at a lot of the world. So it's maybe some of those stories have changed, but it's still a story. And what speculation does, and I love this term that came out of Darko Suvin, which is sort of this term of cognitive estrangement, or the factual reporting of fictions. And what they're talking about is by describing familiar things as if they were unfamiliar, like people do in science fiction, right? Where it seems very, it's the narrative has internal logic. You can believe it's true. Right. And sort of by putting people in a reality like this, what it allows them to do is it distances them from the unfamiliarity of the science in these fictional worlds, and it sort of estranges us from our assumptions about what reality is and forces us to question them. So if you've ever read a really great science fiction book and afterwards, I mean, this is a good one, Inception. When I went to go see Inception, I remember coming out of the theater like grabbing things, right? Like, because I had never thought about this layered simulation theory, and then, was really thinking about that. And it really sort of estranged me from my assumption about reality. But where this is really important is for marginalized people. I'm queer and non-binary, and if I were to read a lot of classic science fiction, I would think that there were no queer people in the future, right? Mm-hmm. Or something like that. But at least, when I actually read sci-fi, which has been a genre, at least in the last 50 years, which has been very welcoming and really reflective of marginalized identities, of queer futures, of Afrofuturism, right? I can actually experience a vision of a future where maybe I can't just be around, but I can thrive or thrive in a new way. And I think this is where it's important, especially for people in that, as you said, that like, I don't know, the mainstream, I don't know what the term is, right? The majority, right? Like for them to undergo a speculative, let's say a book or a project, and to have that cognitive estrangement happen is really important, because, you know, there might be a parallel there about like, you know, oh, like there's a book about how like this alien is different than all the other aliens. And like, you know, that's really hard for them, right? But because it's in the context of an alien, this person can have those feelings and think about what it would be to be estranged or an outsider from one's own community, and still kind of feel safe, right? And you know, have a more deeper discourse. So I do think that is sort of, you know, it's almost like sort of like jogging up the mainstream by giving them a safe way to consider what could be really difficult ideas. And we have a lot of difficult ideas we need to consider. I just read an article today, they're considering taking away the 2-week limit on embryos for doing research, right? You know, that's going to open up a wild ride of the next 50 years of you know, bioethics, bioresearch. You know, we already see what's happening now across the world with people just not really wanting to stand in a lot of ways for being put down and really speaking up against that. And this is going to be very important because people are trying to understand this and process it and deal with it. And a lot of times fiction and speculation can help people to understand and deal with and process these things. Like I've just started reading finally The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, and I'm like glued to it. And I'm like, oh, I needed this book in my life. This is perfect for me to deal with this pandemic. Like I love this. I love it. And it's just helping me like cope and process what's going on around me, right? Because I have this safe space to think about some of these things ahead of time.
Yeah, I really appreciate this idea of the space to think about those things, because I think, and this kind of returns back to something Louisa said earlier about our tendency towards certainty. And so when we find ourselves in an ambiguous situation, we're seeking out that certainty, we often are relying on the things that have always worked, the way we've always understood things, in order to find ourselves in that certainty. And it sounds, Doc, like what you're saying is part of the beauty of science fiction is that it allows us to cling on to some certainty. I know this narrative arc, I know how this works. I can identify with these characters while still being able to explore some of the ambiguity that surrounds those characters and
build empathy, right? Even though these people are fictional future people, it's building empathy. And that's really the same thing we do in UX design and design thinking, as we do all of these activities to decenter our own egos.
Yes.
So, you know, so we don't design for us, right? We design for other people. And so it's like we're doing the same thing, but it's just they're future fictional people instead of maybe real people. But in doing the exercises like that, it helps us to connect and to build that empathy and better speculate.
And there's this like sense of embodiment, right? Like I remember like working with Ukai projects, and one of the notion that just got through to us was stories as they finalize, and stories as like fiction becomes world as they finalize, and becomes habitable, right? And despite the world changing around you, you can go into the stories, embody those stories, and like how we construct these stories are also important. Like one of the reasons that science fiction don't really resonate with me is a lot of the works kind of ruin it for me. You know, so like my race is sort of aesthetically, you know, embodied in this like trapped in the past. Everything depicted around like Asian countries is in the past, and in a story set in the future. And what does that tell me, right? So I think it's really important to also think about different ways the worlds can come together and challenge the notion of futures, because progress is different, development is different. You know, like a lot of the certainty, you know, like this thing that we do leads to a certain future is very different in other cultures, and in some cultures it doesn't even have this like linear, right? Like creation, destroying, like destruction is the same moment, and you're just kind of living in between creation and destruction. You know, how do you explain that in sort of this Western kind of past, present, future?
Right. Yeah, there's so much to digest here, and I'm thinking about kind of coming back. I think language has clearly been a key thread, but I'm also wondering. I know, Andres, you've talked a bit about the way that when it comes to various stories that we might construct, language helps put some either open up possibilities for what that story might look like, or it might close those possibilities. And I'm thinking about the way that different languages provide different avenues into imagining a future simply by the words, or languages where the words are gendered in particular ways, and how that closes off certain futures for folks who don't identify within that binary. And I'm wondering, I know you've done some work in both kind of Spanish and English, and I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the way that language either opens or kind of closes off our abilities to speculate.
Yes, that's funny because most of the work we do, even here in Mexico, most of the time is like in Spanglish. This term we used to say we speak in Espanol, but also we use some words in English. It's because in Spanish, some terms more like strategically, focused or driven are not the same or perceived as the same as the term in Spanish or in English. No, for example, simply the word design. No, if we use diseño in Spanish, most of the people, or the clients at least, understand that it's like art, creativity driven. So if we use, for example, pensamiento de diseño, which is like the Spanish, translation for design thinking, the perception of it is like, oh, we're going to play because we're going to adapt the artistic and the cultural and the creativity mindset, not that designish, more strategic thinking behind design in English. So that's quite interesting, because I think that also that's what drives a lot of practices that ends with design, like future design, strategic design, like service design, like experience design. But that, because in English that will mean that you have like a strategic thinking behind that focus or point of the kickoff. Because if you translated that in Spanish, then it will mean, oh, let's add creativity and art and just whatever to that practice. So I think that that's a big difference. And for us, working in English is a must, because we want to be perceived as strategic, not as artistic, creative. So that's why we're Spanglish. So yeah, that was a really good question.
Yeah, and a really fascinating answer, because I think one of the things that you also touch on is the idea, is the perception of things like play and creativity as not always having a strategic end or outcome or goal.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of what all of your work shows us is that through that play, we actually are able to imagine futures that might help us solve really complex problems. And so I want to engage the audience in a bit of some speculative thinking, and it is a bit of play that I think will help move us into potentially solving some problems. Maybe not in the course of this particular conversation, but thinking about how we might engage in problem solving outside of the immediate. This is the thing from the future. It's an imagination game, and the object of the game is to generate interesting or thought-provoking ideas for certain artifacts or things from the future. So we'll be collaborating as a group. So we'll be engaging the poll function here to create a question. Basically, if you are familiar with Mad Libs, we're essentially creating a Mad Lib. And then we'll pull up the polling function so that you can choose a mood, a time mark, an object, and a context. So we're essentially asking the question in and we'll choose a mood, world, and then we'll choose a time mark, a decade, a century, in the future. So how far in the future are we looking? There is some sort of object that is going to be related to some sort of context. And then we'll collectively work to discover what that is. So the question is, in a mood, or in a certain type of world, a certain time in the future, there is something that exists that is related to a particular context. So my colleagues in the background are going to throw up a poll. Unfortunately, panelists, we aren't allowed to participate. We'll just comment on the participation of the audience. But if you could choose a mood, so how might this experience feel in the future? Is it inspiring? Is it playful? Is it inclusive? Is it natural? We'll then move on to choosing a time mark. How far ahead do we want to imagine? When we come back to the conversation, we'll talk specifically about this looking at time, again, returning to some of the things that Luisa was talking about earlier. So how far ahead, a decade, a century, a millennium, and how does that shift our thinking? And then the object, what is the focus of our imagination today? Are we talking about clothing, food, technology, a toy? And then what is the thematic context for this object? Where it could be found? Is it in communication? Is it something in education? Is it culture more generally? And is it the environment? So I'm going to give all of you an opportunity to vote. I'm going to pretend vote on what I want to talk about, but we're going to let you do this. Oh, it's letting me vote. Okay, then I'm going to vote. And I'll submit my vote. And then on the back end, my colleague Nicole is going to put up the question that we have generated as a group. Are the results in? All right. It looks like inspiring. We're going a century in the future. We're talking about technology. I feel like all of our panelists have a great deal of things to say about that, so that's exciting. Culture and environment. So Nicole, could you put the full question up for our audience in the chat, please? We have some ties though. I'll let you make the call, Nicole. All right. And so then I encourage all of us to answer these questions or answer this question. So in an inspiring world, a century in the future, there is a technology related to the environment. What is it? And panelists here, you can also add your comments. So let me see, do some thinking here.
I think you might be on mute.
Me? Oh, I'm sorry. I was just whispering it to myself. I was moving into,
wow.
Zoom brain. Into critical thinking.
Zoom brain, sorry.
So I'm going to go ahead and add. I encourage our audience to add what you think this object is. In an inspiring world, a century in the future. Century. Ooh, Sarah, that's a great answer. Real-time evaluates the current climate. Caitlin, better ways to generate energy without the cost of our current methods. What about our panelists? What objects do you imagine in an inspiring future, a century from now, related to technology and the environment?
I'm a weird one. I'm gonna go with two algorithms, and the first one's called love, and the second one's called grace, LOVE, and grace. It's just my own joke, but they're basically algorithms or AI that allows humans to better coordinate their production and economic activities in order to not mess up the environment. So basically, there's no economy. AI just figures out supply and demand and routes it intelligently around the world.
That sounds like an inspiring future. I love this from Stephen, one of our attendees. Water bottles that turn into water after being used.
Ooh.
Love that. You just drink your whole water bottle away.
There's some really
Yeah.
cool stuff, Stephen, around water pods with like
Mm.
cellulose linings and seaweed. There's some really cool stuff going on there if you look it up. It's there. I think they sell them for racers who do runs, and they put them in their mouth, and you can just like, it's like a little water pod.
Oh, that's right. I have heard of those. That's interesting. So it helps us reimagine what we have and how those things might change in the future. Bacteria that eats plastic. Oh, that's interesting. So I guess the question then becomes, when we have an answer like this, so bacteria that eats plastic, let's say, what do we do with that answer then? How does that then help us to continue to ask questions and imagine new things?
Well, that's a pretty complex question, but I will start like saying, well, first of all, I will start like asking like the who, where, like what, and in a second hand, like what are like the forces or the signals, that are contributing to this like mindset and idea, and what kind of patterns or change in behaviors may like lead us to there. To understand also like the culture or the values. So again, like start with the questions and understanding like what will happen if, and also once we have like this bacteria idea or concept, let's just start like visualizing like 3 stories. How will that be? How will that see? How will be interacting with that? Do I have to go to the 7-Eleven to buy my bacteria, or it's just a more healthier like procedure, like, so that kind of questions and thinking, I think that's provocative, to start like just building a roadmap.
Mm-hmm.
My first question would be, why would you want a bacteria to, right? Like,
Yeah.
we live in a pandemic right now. Is kill everything, kill bacteria, kill virus. Why, like, where did that idea come from? Like, I have my answers, but I want to ask. I think there are, like,
that's an interesting question, is why now? And why bacteria? And I'm wondering how much of our questions are then indicators of the current moment. So as we're imagining
you hit it. That's exactly the point. All questions are an indicator of our current moment. That is 1000% the point.
Yeah.
And so can you expand on that a little bit, Doc? What does that then help us to better understand? I mean, I think the current moment, but I'm wondering if you could expound on that a little bit.
Sure. So all of us, and like people to different degrees, are trapped by the boundaries of the here and now. And this is why I like sci-fi so much, and it's so interesting, is that you can write about something 1,000 years in the future, but like you are here today. So if I read, A Stranger in a Strange Land by Heinlein, like he might be talking about whatever, but he still has like, like women who are like his live-in servants, because he wrote it in like 1940, and that was his like ideal future. And so by looking at how people ask and frame questions, you can start to identify like where the traps are in their own reality, right? So if you, in order to change your mind, right, this idea of cognitive dissonance, where you're presented with something radically different than what you know, and you can either update your worldview or you can get defensive, right? You need to put yourself into that situation. And this is sort of helps us pick apart what are the barriers that are in the way. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it returns to something that we were talking about earlier, which is how you said one of the steps we need to take is to pay attention, but then to recognize like why we're paying attention to the things we're paying attention to. And I think this does a really good job of kind of showing us our current reality, shows us what we're paying attention to, and helps lead us to this question of why is this the way it is now? Why are we paying attention to this particular thing now? Andres, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, that's why I believe that awareness is like super important. Also like the self-knowledge, because that change, the game, that the starting point, the perspective. So definitely.
Yeah,
So,
and I think you just
go ahead, Luisa.
back around, right? Like as a bacteria, why do I want to eat plastic? Right? Like there's the sense of embodiment. I think when we talk about futures, like one thing that often get left behind is we are always thinking in terms of the human perspective.
Mhm.
We're transitioning into, this ecosystem, this environmental perspective where everything is connected. So we should probably ask, why this other thing wants to do something that we want it to do. And
Right.
kind of, have that sense of, do we understand the bacteria well enough to answer that?
That makes me like wonder, and also like connect this idea about the world's archetypes. So we might have a world that it's more resilient, more adapting, or transformative. So I believe that maybe this kind of why questions should also like be seen through these different lenses. So that will drive, like, of course, different like type of answers.
Yeah, just thinking about, those why questions being seen through different human lenses, and then moving outside of that to look at the lenses outside of the human, the more than human, and thinking about, we don't often think that an object that we encounter on the street has a life of its own, but the reality is when we walk past that object, the object still exists there. It still encounters other people. It encounters other things. The wind may pick it up. It may move it to another location. It encounters new things. So what do we gain from understanding the world from the position of the object itself, as opposed to from the human's encounter with that object? Is everything always come back to the human? I think part of our tendency for that is also, one, certainty. Again, Luisa, coming back to what you started this conversation with, two, but I think one of the challenges in thinking about things from the perspective outside of the human is we don't generally do a very good job of understanding things from different human perspectives already. So when do we move from one human perspective to another, to the object, and how are we all interconnected? I think is really interesting. I'm wondering, as we move into the latter part of the conversation here, I think that it's clear the way that asking these types of questions lead to new questions and help us envision things outside of our own perspectives, which I think is value in and of itself. However, I'm wondering if each of you or one of you wants to talk a little bit about and provide the audience with a little bit of understanding of how these practices have changed something that you've prototyped, or Luisa, you were talking earlier about the opening up of new stories from the work that you were doing with elderly folks. I'm wondering if we could the audience could get a bit more of that. So where have these questions kind of led to something new and exciting, and helped innovate and yeah.
I'm not sure if it's innovative in the way that we believe is innovative, but I think the innovation comes from, trying something new. And I think there are a lot of people doing participatory design, but I don't think there are enough people who really kind of facilitate that turn, right? Like turning from your ego, like asking questions from your ego to asking questions because you want to share with others and make that connection. So I think, it's important for all designers to, it doesn't matter if you brand yourself as participatory or collaborative, kind of asking questions not from your standpoint is something that I learned to be important. And it also prevents, in a way, asking questions that leads to answers that closes the conversation, like that leads nowhere. Like you want the conversations to carry on and kind of live in different spots, right?
Right.
So from my perspective, I have so much things to say. Okay, so here it goes. I'm gonna talk from the bottom of my futures-proof heart. So, for me, the futures and how questions and language drive innovation, like start with the willingness to change, and I connect and relate that to mindset, because we will need to have this mindset, to just to have, again, like the will to change. And once we start having this mindset, then we may be open, to make more complex questions, or more uncertain and ambiguous type of questions. And at the end, for me, that's super valuable, because that gave us the opportunity to build and design possible concepts that are futures proof. Because when we have this mindset, like how can we be, or build something like it's futures proof, that means we are considering, a lot of elements and stuff beyond this human centric approach, like you guys were talking about. So it's more about the life centric, the stakeholder centricity centric, like the sustainability centric. And once we start like adapting this kind of mindsets to the practice, then I believe that we can like build like more powerful innovations. And at the end, that's why like my purpose and my mission and what drives me is like thinking like I want to build innovation, or facilitate innovation from the futures driven perspective, which again is like the mindset, the willingness to change, and this futures proof concept. I don't know if that makes sense, but
100% on the will to change.
Yeah, I just want to design worlds. I don't want to design anything. Just kidding. I want to design change. I told this to my boss the other day. He was like, so where do you see yourself in 5 years? I'm like, I'm tired of designing interfaces. I want to design worlds now. And it's funny because I'm actually 100% serious. I don't have to mean like this world, right? I can worlds, like I mean worlds within games or within other people's minds and stuff. But I guess for me, sort of speaking about, there's sort of two ways. One is personal and one is like more professional. So the professional way is that I think that being able to have a speculative mindset and being able to do this has helped me connect with other people and share my vision for things in a way that connects with them and drives action. So I did my thesis in grad school on the blockchain for the makers movement, or how the blockchain could enable this future where we had distributed production, and you could make stuff in a more localized way. And a lot of the inspiration for that going in was like reading different theories and kind of looking at what's going on around me with digital fabrication, learning how to laser cut and CNC at school, and be like, wow, I can't believe this is so easy. And I felt so, I didn't have access to it until I learned. But at the same time, reading books like The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson, where there is like a future where people can print stuff out at home, and there's like this really interesting deep social commentary looking at what that would be like and what problems there would be with that, right? So that combination allowed me to do my project in a more speculative way, to build it out, to make it kind of look like it worked, to pitch it like it was a real company, even though like I never really intended it to be a real company, to the point where I got a cease and desist from like the company whose name like I was like using apparently, Unum. And so yeah, so that's like the real way. And then somebody found it from another country and they're like, I had the same idea. And they're like, and here's all these other people that had this idea. And then they invited us all to Warsaw, and we had this wonderful meeting where we shared our ideas and we shared our visions, and each of us was good at something different and had a different piece of the puzzle, but we're still working together now as this alliance to keep thinking about this and push the work forward. And I think what you're going to see in the following years is, when we look at an organization or like a company, it's going to be more like how you organize yourselves and the company you keep, right? It's going to be a lot more flexible, and we're going to start to see people coming together because they can now. And I think the pandemic's really accelerated this, because people are now more comfortable with these virtual collaboration platforms, whether they like them or not. People are going to start organizing themselves and coming together in these ways to think about this. The personal way I will say is just, I always say like, I read science fiction as like an inoculation against the future, but that's like a cheap way of saying it. Like, I think that staying speculative is very healthy because it helps you to be resilient, right? It's like, you know, it helps you to sort of, you know, have the punches to be able to roll with them. And it's because when you are a speculative person and when you saturate your brain and when you pay attention, when you understand what you're paying attention to, when you talk to other people about it, you are keeping your own brain flexible and allowing new information in that's not going to break you, right? You're going to stay flexible. And I'll just sort of end it with, as I told you, I've been reading The Parable of the Sower, and there's this quote from the book that I love, which is that all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And this is this book's like religion thing, but it just really struck with me. It's such a true statement, right? That we're constantly changing, we're constantly evolving, we're constantly changing things, and we just need to feel like we have the right and the power to create change in our own lives and not just be changed by these forces around us. And that is why I think speculation helps us to do.
Yeah, I
That's
think
beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've really pulled from our conversation today is speculating provides us with a particular sense of agency, to think differently and imagine differently. And when we then engage others in those conversations, we're inviting others and allowing them to have agency to engage one another, to think differently, to imagine differently, and move us into the future. This was. There's so much. I know, Andres, earlier you were like, I have so much to say. I have so many questions, and maybe that's the entire purpose, is that we don't answer anything here. We continue to step away and continue to ask questions. I want to thank all of you for taking the time today to share with us, with the Planet Word audience and with the Shared Studios audience around the globe, your expertise on this way of thinking and asking. As we wrap things up, I just want to come back to a number of things that you said, kind of put them all together. Beginning, Andres, with something you said: to innovate, we must have the will. And then I just started thinking we must have the will to go on a quest, to answer questions, and to view things to speculate, to view things from different vantage points. I just want to also leave with to share with our panelists again something that Doc shared earlier, which is to pay attention to what we're paying attention to, and to engage others in conversation about those things, to help us imagine. Hopefully, you know, a number of us have been hearing as we make our way kind of out of, or at least see the light at the end of the pandemic tunnel. I want to go back to some semblance of normal. I want to return to a normal. And I hope that today's conversation helps everybody think about what was normal, what were we paying attention to then, how has this shifted our attention, and how might we imagine a future that's different on the other side of this. Is there any closing words that you all would like to give to our panel, or to our audience?
I'll just give a little plug. If you want to keep thinking about, you know, this question of what's next, you know, what's normal, looking at the pandemic, looking at the future, we encourage you to come to our annual conference. It's going to be online this year. It's called Primer. We do it every year. Usually it's in person, but last year we did it online, and we're going to be doing it online again this year. It should be in early summer. So please join us. And if you're interested in learning more about how you can take some of the stuff you learned today and apply it in your job or organization, we just started a wonderful new class called Futures by Design. It's an all weekend workshop where we guide you through a framework. I hate this. I just like to think it's like a set of mindsets for being good at speculation in different ways. I hate calling it this, like, it's like these steps, but it's almost like the design thinking of speculative design, in that there's steps or stages will help you go through it. It's going to be a whirlwind, but it's a lot of fun, and it'll help you really do a project from beginning to end in an organizational setting. So those are just my like 2 little plugs. And if you want to keep paying attention, you're also welcome to check out my newsletter, where that's kind of like, I actually see it as my way of like word vomiting what it is I'm paying attention to force me to pay attention every 2 weeks. So if you want to see like what I think is interesting in the world, like you can kind of go through the events and the news I pick and see, be like, huh, like what's that happening? So check it out. I think you guys shared it earlier.
Yeah, so we've shared several links in the chat today. Thank you again for joining us. And I want to thank the audience. If you're looking for other events associated with Planet Word, please check out their website. And for upcoming events with Shared Studios, please go to sharedstudios.com. Doc, Luisa, Andres, thank you so much. I will be moving into the rest of my day asking more questions than I started with, which I think is a beautiful thing. So thank you all and have a wonderful afternoon or evening wherever you are.
Bye, everyone.